So in this section we're going to continue our conversation about theology proper, but now we're going to turn our attention to attributes of God. We've already touched on that a little bit as we talked about God's existence, but we were there really asserting that God exists and not much more. So you want to have tucked away in your mind a rough understanding of what the different arguments for God's existence are, the ones that we covered on the video. Here we're going to turn to saying some other things about God. It'll bring back to mind some of the things that we talked about in method of theology, apophatic and cataphatic and dialectical theology. We want to make sure as we get ready to progress here, to follow down this trail, that we understand going forth that our language is always going to fall short. If God is truly above and beyond our ability to understand. Yes, he's revealed himself to us, but if he's kind of supremely beyond what we could imagine, then we ought not to be surprised that our language falls grossly short. So our language is always analogical. It is by comparison, it's always going to have inadequacies. That's just the way it is. So with that kind of understanding that at some point our language is going to break down, at some point our language is going to end up with maybe even contradictions or ironies or paradoxes, whatever. We just want to understand that as we move forward into some of this stuff that language is going to not be our best friend, even though we don't have any other option to talk about God. So we asked the question last time, what can we say? We asserted that God exists, and we looked at the different arguments for the existence of God. But we want to unpack that a little bit more now and look at some things that flow from this God that exists. So we can look at the fact that God is living, we believe, and that God is personal, and then God is spirit. So let's look at each of those here in the next couple slides. So what does it mean for us to say that God is living? Well, it's language that we'd use all the time, right? But it's not. It's one of those things. It's kind of like, how do you describe coffee, more or less? It's very difficult to kind of get our minds around. Well, to say that God is living means in some way that God is like us. That there's an existential quality. There is a life that is in motion. That is, and by that I'm not saying that God is always like perpetual movement, but one of the ways that ancient theologians would talk about God is that God was pure act. God is moving. There's a dynamism with God rather than God being kind of static. He's not just kind of this frozen moment in time where everything is all there at this kind of like omega point kind of a thing. Rather, there's a dynamism to him. In some way, life with God, or God's life, parallels our lives. More correctly said, our lives parallel his. We want to be very careful. I'm not saying that God experiences time necessarily like we do, although that will be talked about here as we move forward. But there does seem to be this kind of motion, this activity involved in God's own life. God seems to be needing to be experienced rather than just observed. He's not something on a slide under a microscope that we're supposed to say, oh, there's God. That's what we're supposed to understand about God. Rather, God is to be encountered, is to be experienced. And that, just as I said at the beginning, trying to define coffee, well, in a lot of ways, God affirming that God is living is sort of like trying to write a research paper on what a kiss is. If you've kissed someone, even not in a romantic way, even just in a family way, you kiss your mother goodnight, or your father goodnight, or your sister that you haven't seen in a while, whatever. If you have to explain the kiss, you probably have done it wrong. there's something about this that is just supposed to be encountered. It's not simply supposed to be kind of sterile, stagnant. It is truly alive. It is to be lived. So, what does it mean for God to be personal? It means several things. At one level, it means that God's not just a force, this impersonal force. He's not just, may the force be with you, the power for good, goodwill. That is not God. Some forms of Hinduism would have God as an impersonal force. Some other religions would have that as well. That is not true for the Christian faith. Our God is personal. We also mean by that he's differentiated. I'm using that term. Sometimes theologians will use the term distinct. All I'm trying to say here is that this is really kind of weird to think about, but in some way there are limits to God's being. I'm not saying there are limits to God, but follow what I'm trying to say here for a moment. We will eventually talk about the doctrine of creation. As we do that, for God to create something or to have something else to interact with, there has to be something outside of God that isn't God. It seems that God, just by the act of creation, that act is a self-limiting act. Now, I think that holds. Where that falls apart is that God is a social trinity that we'll talk about next time we're together. That God has never done anything alone. We understand it in the Christian faith that there are three persons. But so I think this point still is there, is to talk about the three persons of the Trinity is to understand that while the Spirit is God and the Father is God, the Spirit is not the Father. There is a differentiation that's occurring. There's a distinction that happens. So originally I was saying between God and creation. I think that's true, but it's even true within the Godhead. There's a uniqueness, a differentiation that happens. It also means that God is that God is conscious. That at some level God is self-aware. Now that again almost seems silly to apply to God. Of course, God is the ultimate found ground of all being. How could he not be self-aware? But we're trying to grasp what it is to think about God, and so in a lot of ways it's going to be like little children trying to find the right word when we don't have enough vocabulary. But there seems to be a consciousness, a self-awareness to God. Then there's also this volitional aspect, which is a big fancy term. That God seems to have a will. He has something that he wants to have done, to be accomplished, that he desires, and that is part of what it means to be personal, to have a will, to be interacting with the environment around you and other beings, and to see certain things happen, to have purposes occur. And then obviously to assert that God is personal means that God is knowable in some way. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever to be talking of, we could have all the arguments for God's existence that we could, and we could definitively establish the fact that God exists, but if we don't know who this God is, then everything else is just absurd. So this idea that God is knowable, and that then also implies that God wants to be known, and that then God relates to people. So that's all wrapped up with this idea of God being personal. And then lastly for this part, what does it mean for God to be spirit? This is the one that we're kind of shooting an arrow into the dark here. We don't really know what we're talking about, but this is my best shot here. So I affirmed that God is somehow differentiated, that the Father is different from the Spirit, that the God is different from creation. Yes. He's not just differentiated from, though, but he's different from us. So we looked at living and said, in that way, to talk about God as living, that gets us closest in this way of talking about God to being like us. That's the one we understand best. What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be a spirit? To be spirit, that's the one that's kind of furthest from our understanding. Farthest, I think I said furthest, but we don't know what to even think about this. And so God is different from us, not just differentiated from us. At the very least, in some way, it means it's not limited. God is not limited by the things that we are, and by that we're meaning primarily issues of time and space. That like matter, energy, things like that. Those don't seem to be things for God like they are issues and things for us. So at some level, that seems to be what we're talking about when we say that God is spirit. So we're going to continue here, and we've looked at this God exists idea. Now the second point that we can say is that God is transcendent. Well, how do we get there? Well, God, if he exists, seems to be beyond our comprehension, beyond our ability to fully understand, greater in power, greater in wisdom. There's some way in which God surpasses all of our understanding and all of our ability to begin to make sense even. So we could talk about things like God being infinite, that God doesn't have limits. That term, even though I don't think I used that one, but that should kind of flags, you should see that as an apophatic theology term there, infinite. What do we think about God? Well, God doesn't have limits, so he must be he's not must be. To say he doesn't have limits is to say he is infinite. Theology by negation we talked about. God is eternal. This is how God relates to time. That he surpasses time in ways that we can't. He transcends time. We could say the same way that God surpasses space in the same way. God seems to be unchanging in ways that we seem to almost entirely experience change. So like I'm the same Rob Douglas that was born 50 years ago, right? But at another level, there's nothing about me that's the same. I wasn't born needing glasses. Somewhere around 4, I had a lot of hair. I was only a few feet tall at one point. All of that. Life is full of change. That is not true of God in some way. The God is unchanging. Now, at least unchanging in his character, at least unchanging in his purpose, as we want to affirm. We will talk about how much God may or may not change in other ways as we proceed. But those are ways of talking about God's transcendence. So we want to unpack that a little more as we proceed before we go to other ways of thinking about God's character, his attributes. So it is this issue of transcendence and immanence. The term transcendence is an attribute of God that you'll want to have tucked away. Transcendence is the idea that God is he's up there, he's above, he's beyond, just wilder than your greatest thought. He surpasses everything. Immanence is the exact opposite. He's closer than your next breath. He's your best friend. He's your lover. He's the maker of your heart. Those things that put God close is immanence. So transcendence here, God is other. God is self-sufficient and needs nothing from us. We'll look at that more in a little bit, but that's an example of transcendence. Earlier theologians tended to emphasize transcendence. If you think of how churches from about the time of Constantine up until really the 1970s, maybe even later, churches were constructed to convey transcendence. That you were to enter and to actually feel small because the big presence of God was actually there. You think of cathedrals where you would walk in, and almost always there would be a big rose stained glass window in the front, and so your eyes were immediately supposed to lift in a position of prayer just by walking in the doors. It's to get your attention, but by your head going up, you begin to start to feel small. So for a long period of the church's history, we have emphasized the transcendence of God. If this is taken to its kind of terminus, if it's taken to the most extreme end, we end up with something like deism. What's deism? Deism is the idea that there is a God, that God exists, that God created, but that God actually isn't involved in the lives of human beings now. He kind of just set the world in motion, and he's not really that interested. Well, that's too mean to say. He has set it up so that the thing can perpetuate. So he personally is not involved. Deists would not have believed in miracles, for example. There weren't these supernatural interventions of God personally interacting with his creation. So if transcendence is, if you go overboard with transcendence, you end up really with this idea of deism, that this God is there, he's supreme and everything else, but he's not actually involved in any kind of way. Now, on the other hand, we have immanence. Immanence is the theology of how close God is. More recently, theologians have tended to emphasize God's immanence, how close he is to us, how close he is to us in our struggles, or how close he is to the poor, or how close he is to whomever, but how close God is. Both of these things are absolutely true. There's no question about them. God does sustain all things in their being, by his being, so he's actually actively involved in his creation and in the providence of his creation. I would argue that we have to somehow keep God's immanence, his closeness, and his transcendence in balance. That we can't have a time where one is over against the other. I think there was a time where we had overemphasized the transcendence of God and didn't realize how close he was to us and how much he loved us. But I think sometimes in contemporary Christian spirituality, in contemporary Christianity in the Western Hemisphere, at least in America, I think there's an overemphasis on immanence. Some of our church traditions will have a prayer at the beginning of the service. More liturgical ones will call it an invocation. Less ones will just have a kind of an opening prayer, but where we invite God to be present, or invite God to reveal his presence. But if we really meant that when we prayed those prayers in our worship services, we should be handing out hard hats and seat belts. I mean, if this God who created everything that there is shows up, look out. This is serious stuff. When was the last time that our knees trembled when we worshiped God? When was the last time that we couldn't get off of our face, or we couldn't dare to open our eyes? We like Jesus as our best friend, our chum, our lover, all that stuff. And I'm not saying that's not true, but that's not all it is. And so we really must, I think, kind of come back from the immanence a little bit and learn to keep these things in a little more tension than we have so far. We seem to try to resolve the tension, and when we do that, we kind of fall off on either side. I think I'm going to pause here, and then we'll pick up in a second with some more discussion about different ways, not necessarily different attributes, but different ways that God's attributes can be understood or divided. So remember, we're kind of doing this course according to a systematic theology. So I've talked about sort of an introductory way that the attributes could be talked about. I'm going to, as we proceed, going to talk about a couple different ways that these folders could be laid out. Same material in all of them, but different ways of divvying them up. So we'll continue there.